Some folks will tell you a man doesn't notice the small things, but that's not true. Not really. Because sometimes it's the smallest things that stay with you the longest, like the way a chair sits empty across a table, or how coffee tastes different when there's no one there to pour the second cup. And for 3 years straight, Ethan Hayes had only ever set one plate down on his table. Same spot, same time, morning and night. A quiet routine that settled into the walls of his cabin like dust. That never quite leaves, the kind of silence that doesn't feel loud at first, but over time, it starts to press in on you, slow and steady, until even the creak of your own boots sounds like company. And maybe that's why he agreed to the marriage, though he never would have said it out loud, not to the men in town, not to himself, because a man like Ethan didn't go looking for warmth. He went looking for something practical, something that made sense, someone who could keep a house, cook a meal, tend to the small things he'd stopped paying attention to. So when they lined up the women at the depot that morning, dresses faded from travel, hands folded tight like they were holding on to something invisible, he didn't look for beauty, didn't listen to the chatter or the laughter or the low voices making quiet judgments. His eyes moved slower than that, steady as a man checking fence lines. And that's when he saw her, standing just a little apart, not pushing forward, not trying to be seen. A plain calico dress hanging loose at the shoulders, dust caught along the hem. Her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the crowd like she wasn't expecting anything at all. And there was something about that, something that didn't ask and didn't plead, that made him pause longer than he meant to, because most folks, when they've got nothing left, they reach, but she didn't. She just stood there, still as a post in dry ground. And when the others were chosen one by one, smiles breaking across their faces like sudden sunlight, she stayed where she was, quiet, unnoticed. The last one left when the talking died down and the crowd started to shift. And that's when Ethan stepped forward, boots hitting the wood with that slow, certain rhythm that turned heads without him needing to say a word. He didn't look at the faces first, didn't weigh options the way the others had. His gaze dropped instead, just for a moment, to her hands, rough at the edges, fingers marked with the kind of work you don't learn overnight. And something settled in his chest then, not loud, not clear, just a quiet knowing, the kind a man trusts without needing to understand. "I'll take her," he said, simple as that, like he was choosing a tool he knew would hold up. And the murmurs started right after, low and quick, like wind through dry grass. But he didn't wait for them, didn't explain himself, just turned and started walking back toward his wagon, giving her the space to follow or not, because even then, he wasn't the kind of man to take without offering a choice. And behind him, after a pause that stretched just long enough to matter, came the sound of a single set of footsteps, light but steady, closing the distance between them. And for the first time in 3 years, though he didn't realize it yet, Ethan Hayes was no longer walking back to an empty house. The wagon wheels rolled slow over the dry Texas road, wood creaking with each turn, the sound steady enough to settle into a man's bones if he let it. And Ethan Hayes kept his eyes forward, hands loose on the reins, not rushing the horses, not turning around either, because he had never been one to fill silence with words, and the woman behind him did not seem like the kind who needed them. Clara Whitmore sat with her small case resting against her boots, fingers folded in her lap, not gripping, not fidgeting, just resting like she had already decided this was where she would be. And that alone was enough. The wind carried dust in soft waves across the road, catching in the folds of her dress, brushing against Ethan's coat, the kind of wind that dried everything it touched, land, skin, even a man's thoughts if he stayed out in it long enough. And for a while neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of them reached for it. The silence between them was not sharp, not heavy, just there, like a stretch of open land that did not ask to be crossed any faster than it needed to be. After near an hour, the ranch came into view, low and weathered, sitting alone against a wide sky, the barn off to one side, fence lines running out in long, uneven stretches, and the house, small, square, with a single window catching the late afternoon light. It looked like a place that had been standing long enough to forget what it was built for. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch, climbed down first, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. He reached for her case without looking directly at her, not out of coldness, just habit, and she let him take it, stepping down on her own, steady, careful, like she trusted her footing more than anything else. The porch boards creaked under their weight, a familiar sound to him, new to her. The door opened with a slight drag against the floor, same as it always had. Inside, the air held that quiet stillness of a place left alone too long, not dirty, not neglected, just empty in a way that settled into the corners. The table stood near the window, one chair pushed in, the other turned slightly aside like it had not been used in years. The stove sat cold, iron dull from disuse. Clara stepped in without hesitation, her eyes moving once across the room, taking in the space not like a guest, but like someone measuring something unseen. Ethan set her case down near the wall, straightened, and spoke for the first time since they left town, his voice low. "Even, you can take the room through there," he said, nodding toward the narrow doorway at the back. "I sleep in the loft." He paused, not searching for more words, just letting the ones he had settle where they needed to. "You handle the house, I handle the rest." Simple as that. No questions about where she came from, no expectations beyond what could be done with two hands and a steady mind. Clara gave a small nod, not eager, not hesitant, just accepting. She moved to her case, unclasped it, and from inside she pulled a folded cloth, white once, now worn soft with time. She crossed to the table and spread it out across the rough wood, smoothing the corners with both hands, until it lay flat, and something shifted in the room then, not loud, not sudden, just a small change, like a window opening somewhere you could not see. Ethan noticed it without understanding why, his gaze resting on that piece of cloth longer than it should have, then moving away as he turned toward the door again. Outside, the wind carried on like it always did, but inside, for the first time in years, the house did not feel entirely empty. Morning came quiet over the ranch, the kind of light that slipped in slow through the window and settled across the table before a man even opened his eyes. And Ethan Hayes woke the way he always did, not to a sound, not to a voice, just to the habit of years that did not ask for anything more. He climbed down from the loft with the same steady movements, boots finding each rung without thought. But when his feet met the floor, something felt different. Not wrong, just not the same as the day before, and it took him a moment to see it. The stove was already lit, a low, steady fire glowing behind the iron door, and the faint smell of coffee filled the room. Not strong, not bitter, just there, like it had every right to be. Clara stood by the counter, sleeves rolled just past her wrists, her hands moving in quiet, practiced motions, not rushed, not uncertain, as if she had done this in this exact kitchen before. Though he knew she had not. She did not look up when he stepped closer, only shifted slightly to set a tin cup on the table, then another, 2 cups where there had always been one. Ethan paused for half a second, his eyes moving from the cups to the tablecloth she had laid out the night before, still smooth, still centered, then back to her. He did not say thank you, not because he did not feel it, but because the word did not come easy to him, and she did not wait for it. She poured the coffee evenly between the cups, the dark liquid steaming in the cool morning air, then stepped back just enough to give him space, the kind of space that did not push him away, but did not crowd him either. They sat across from each other without a word, the chairs making a soft scrape against the floor, and for a moment, nothing moved but the thin line of steam rising from the cups. Ethan reached for his, took a slow sip, and something shifted again, not in the taste, but in the way it felt to drink it, like the act itself carried more weight than it had the day before. Clara folded her hands loosely in her lap before lifting her own cup, her movements measured, quiet, not trying to match him, not trying to avoid him, just existing in the same space without asking permission. After a while, Ethan set his cup down, stood, and reached for his coat, the day outside already waiting for him in the form of fences that needed checking and horses that needed tending. He paused near the door, not turning fully, just enough to speak. "There is water out back," he said. "Pump sticks a little. You have to pull it twice before it runs steady." Clara nodded once, her eyes meeting his for just a second, not holding, not dropping, just there, steady as the rest of her. And that should have been the end of it. Just another morning, just another set of instructions. But when he stepped outside, something caught his attention before he reached the barn. The pump handle moved once, then again, and on the second pull, water flowed clean and even. No sputter, no delay. He stopped where he was, watching for a moment longer than necessary, the small adjustment. The kind of man might not notice unless he had spent years working around it. And he found himself wondering, not in a loud way, not in a way that demanded answers, just a quiet thought settling in the back of his mind. How she knew to fix it so quickly, how her hands had moved without hesitation, and he did not turn back to ask, not yet, because some things, he had learned, revealed themselves better when left alone. But as he walked toward the barn, the morning no longer felt like a repeat of the last, and the ranch, for reasons he could not name, seemed just a little less worn than it had the day before. By the third morning, the house had begun to settle into a rhythm that neither of them spoke about, but both of them moved within, like two people walking the same path without needing to agree on each step. Ethan Hayes came down from the loft just before sunrise, the sky outside still holding that pale blue edge before the day turned warm, and again the stove was already burning, not too hot, not wasteful, just enough to take the chill off the room. Clara Whitmore stood near the window this time, her hands resting lightly on the back of the chair as she looked out toward the fence line, not searching, not waiting, just observing in a way that felt steady, grounded, as if the land itself had something to say and she knew how to listen. Ethan paused halfway across the room, his gaze following hers for a brief second. The far fence leaned slightly to the left where the posts had loosened over time. He had meant to fix it weeks ago, maybe longer, but it had become one of those things a man learns to live around, not because he cannot fix it, but because there are always 10 other things ahead of it. He moved past her without comment, reaching for his cup as she poured coffee. The same quiet exchange as before. 2 cups, 2 plates, the small routine beginning to feel less like an interruption and more like something that belonged there. They ate in silence again, but it was not the same silence as the first day. It had softened, just enough that it did not press against the ears. When he finished, he stepped outside, the air cool against his face, and started toward the barn, but halfway. There he stopped. The fence post that had leaned for weeks now stood straight, the wire pulled tight, not overly strained, just set right. He walked closer, crouched slightly to check the base. The soil had been packed firm around it, not fresh and loose, but pressed down in a way that meant it would hold. He did not hear her come up behind him, but he felt it, the quiet shift in presence, and when he stood, she was there a few steps back, her hands clean, no sign of strain, no need to explain. "You noticed," she said, her voice calm, not seeking approval, just stating what was already clear. Ethan looked at the post again, then at her. "You should not have done that alone," he replied, not harsh, just practical. Clara tilted her head slightly, a small movement that carried more thought than it showed. "It was not difficult," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made the words feel different, not dismissive, not proud, just honest in a way that did not match what he expected from someone who had arrived with nothing but a single case and a quiet presence. He studied her for a moment longer than he had before, not searching for answers exactly, but trying to place something that did not quite fit into the space he had made for her in his mind. Most folks who came out this way needed time to learn the land, to understand how it moved, how it held, how it resisted, but she moved through it like someone who had already asked those questions somewhere else, somewhere long before this place. And for the first time, a thought came to him that stayed longer than the others. Not loud, not urgent, just there, steady as a post, set deep into the ground. That perhaps the woman he had brought home was not as simple as the town had decided. And as he turned back toward the barn, leaving her by the fence line, the ranch no longer felt like something he carried alone, though he had not yet decided what that truly meant. By the end of the week, the changes did not come all at once, not in ways a man could point to and name, but in the small things that gathered quietly until they could no longer be ignored. Ethan Hayes noticed it first in the barn, the way the tools were set back in their places without being asked, not just put away, but arranged in a manner that made sense, handles turned outward, weight balanced so a man could reach without thinking. The kind of order that does not slow a day down, but eases it in ways that are hard to explain. He had always kept his tools where he could find them, but this was different. This was someone thinking ahead of the next task, not just finishing the last one, and he found himself pausing more than once, hand hovering over a hammer or a length of rope, recognizing that what he needed was already where it should be. Later that afternoon, He rode the perimeter of the north field, the ground dry from weeks without proper rain, the soil cracked in long, thin lines that spoke of a season turning the wrong way. He had seen it before, knew what it meant if it held. Less grass, thinner cattle, longer days that gave back less than they took. But when he came back toward the house, something else caught his eye. A narrow trench cut along the edge of the field, shallow but deliberate, guiding what little water there was toward the lower ground instead of letting it run off and disappear. He dismounted slowly, crouched beside it, running his fingers through the dirt. It had been done with care, not rushed, not guessed, measured in a way that showed understanding. He did not remember doing it, and he knew no one else had been out there. When he stepped back, he saw her near the well, sleeves rolled again, drawing water into a bucket with the same steady motion as before. He walked toward her, not quickly, but with a purpose that had been building all morning. "You have worked land before," he said, not a question, not exactly. Clara set the bucket down, wiped her hands on the side of her skirt, and met his gaze for a moment that held longer than usual. "A little," she answered, and that was all. No explanation, no story, just those two words that settled between them without offering anything more. Ethan studied her, the same quiet way he studied a stretch of fence or a change in the sky, looking for what was not said as much as what was. Most people would have filled that space with details, trying to prove something, trying to be seen in a certain light. But she did not. She let the silence stand, and in that silence, he found himself thinking again about the town, about the way they had spoken of her, the lowest girl, the one left standing, the one no one wanted, and he felt a small shift in that memory. Not loud, not sharp, just enough to make it feel incomplete, as if something had been missed by everyone there, including himself. He nodded once, not pressing further, and turned back toward the house. But as he walked, the thought stayed with him, steady and quiet, like a line drawn in the dirt that you do not notice until you realize it has been guiding your steps all along. And for the first time since she had arrived, Ethan Hayes began to understand that whatever he had brought home from that depot, it was not something simple, and it was not something he fully understood yet, but it was already changing the ground beneath his feet in ways he could not ignore. That evening, the wind shifted just enough to carry a cooler edge across the land, the kind that hinted at change without promising it. And inside the house, the light from the oil lamp settled soft against the walls, turning the rough wood into something warmer than it had any right to be. Ethan Hayes stepped in from the yard with the dust of the day still on his boots, setting his hat on the same peg he always used. But his eyes did not go to the floor or the stove the way they usually did. They went to the table, two plates already set, not perfectly matched, but placed with intention, the cloth still lying flat beneath them, its edges smoothed like it had been cared for more than once. Clara Whitmore stood by the stove, stirring something slow and steady, the smell of beans and salt pork filling the space, not strong, not heavy, just enough to remind a man that food could be more than something to get through. He washed his hands at the basin without speaking, the water cool against his skin, and when he turned back, she had already taken her seat, not waiting, not rushing him, just sitting as if this had always been the order of things. He sat across from her, the chair giving its familiar creak, and for a while they ate without a word, the quiet broken only by the small sounds of spoon against plate and the fire settling in the stove. But there was something different in the way he looked at her now, not direct, not obvious, just a glance that stayed a moment, longer than before, as if he was beginning to notice not just what she did, but how she did it, the steadiness of her hands, the way she never wasted movement, the way she seemed to understand the space without asking about it. After a time, he set his spoon down, leaned back slightly, and spoke. "You fixed the north field runoff," he said, his voice low, not accusing, not praising, just placing the fact between them. Clara did not look surprised. She only nodded once. "It was losing too much water," she replied. Simple as that. And the way she said it made it sound less like a task and more like something obvious, something that had only needed to be seen. Ethan watched her for a moment, then asked the question he had been holding since that afternoon. "Where did you learn that?" Clara paused, not in hesitation, but in thought, as if deciding how much to give and how much to leave unsaid. "My father kept land," she said finally, not adding more, not shaping it into a story, just offering the smallest piece that could still stand on its own. Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the table for a brief second before lifting again. There was a shift in him then, quiet but certain, the kind that does not change a man all at once, but moves something in place just enough that it cannot go back to where it was. He did not ask anything further, did not press into her past or try to fill the silence she left, because he understood something now that he had not before, that whatever she carried with her was not something she would lay out all at once, and perhaps it was not something that needed to be named yet. They finished the meal in that same quiet, but it was not empty, not the kind that presses against a man. It held something steadier now, something that did not demand words to prove it was there. And when Ethan stood to clear his plate, he did something he had not done in years. He picked up hers as well, not as a gesture, not as a statement, just as a simple action that felt right in the moment. And Clara watched him for a brief second, not surprised, not questioning, just seeing it for what it was, a small shift, barely noticeable to anyone else, but enough to mark the beginning of something neither of them had planned. And outside, the wind carried on across the land, but inside, the house held its warmth a little longer than it had the night before. The next few days did not arrive with anything sudden or loud. No moment a man could point to and say this is where it changed, but something continued to settle between them, slow as dust falling through sunlight, until even the quiet carried a different weight. Ethan Hayes found himself noticing her without meaning to, not in the way a man looks directly, but in the edges of things, the way she moved through the house without disturbing it, the way she stepped around a chair instead of into it, the way her hands paused for a fraction of a second before finishing a task, as if she was always thinking one step ahead of what came next. And it was not just inside the house anymore. The land itself began to show small signs of her presence. The south gate that used to drag now opened clean with a single push, the trough near the barn filled without spilling over, the path from the well worn smoother where loose stones had been set back into place, none of it done for show, none of it mentioned, just there, like it had always belonged that way. One afternoon, Ethan stood near the fence line, watching the cattle move slower than usual through the dry grass, their pace telling him what the land had already begun to say. The season was turning harder, and there were not many ways to change that once it had started. He rested his arm against the top rail, eyes scanning the ground, when Clara came up beside him. Not close enough to crowd, not far enough to feel distant, just there, matching the space he left. "You see it too," she said, her voice low, steady. Ethan did not turn right away, just nodded once. "Not enough moisture," he replied. "The grass will thin if it holds." Clara followed his gaze, her eyes moving across the field in a way that did not rush, taking in the slope, the direction of the wind, the way the soil broke under the weight of the animals. "We can slow it," she said after a moment. Not with urgency, not like a promise, just a simple statement laid out in front of him. Ethan glanced at her then, a quiet question in his look. "How?" he asked. Clara shifted her weight slightly, one hand resting against the fence post. "There is a low point past the east ridge," she said. "The ground dips before it rises again. If we guide what little water we get toward it, it will hold longer, give the grass a chance to root deeper." Ethan frowned just slightly, not in doubt, but in thought. "I have seen that dip," he said, "but never used it." Clara gave a small nod. "It was not shaped for it," she said. "Not yet." And there it was again, that way she spoke, not guessing, not hoping, but seeing something that had not been there before and treating it like it already existed. Ethan let the silence sit between them, the wind moving through the fence rails with a soft, steady sound. Most men would have questioned her more, asked how she knew, why it would work, but he found himself doing something different. He listened, not just to her words, but to the certainty behind them, and after a moment, he nodded once. "We will look at it in the morning," he said. Clara did not smile, did not show relief or pride. She only nodded back, as if the decision had already been made before he spoke it. And they stood there a while longer, watching the field together, not speaking, not needing to, because something had shifted again, quiet as ever, but deeper this time, like roots finding their way into ground that had been left untouched too long. And for the first time since she arrived, Ethan Hayes did not feel like he was carrying the weight of the land alone, though he still had not said it out loud, and neither had she. They started before the sun had fully risen, the kind of early hour when the air still held a trace of cool and the land had not yet hardened under the heat. Ethan Hayes saddled the horses in silence, the leather creaking soft under his hands, while Clara Whitmore stepped out of the house with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Not much to carry, just what was needed, and nothing more. They rode side by side toward the east ridge, not close, not distant, the space between them easy in a way that did not need to be measured. The ground shifted as they went, from packed dirt to looser soil, the kind that told a man where water had once passed and where it had been lost. When they reached the low point she had spoken of, Ethan slowed his horse, looking out across the dip in the land. It was shallow, easy to miss if a man was not paying attention, the slope gentle enough that rain would pass through without stopping, leaving nothing behind. Clara dismounted first, her boots touching the ground with a quiet certainty. She walked the length of the dip, her eyes tracing lines that were not yet there. Ethan followed, watching not just where she stepped, but where she paused. She knelt near the center, running her fingers through the dry soil, letting it fall back slowly. It does not hold because it has no edge, she said, more to the land than to him. If we give it shape, it will stay. Ethan crossed his arms loosely, studying the space again. You are thinking of a basin, he said. Clara nodded once. Shallow, not deep, enough to catch and guide, not trap. Her words came steady, like she had already walked this ground before in her mind. Ethan looked out over the surrounding slope, calculating without speaking, the distance, the direction of runoff, the effort it would take with just the two of them. It will take time, he said. Clara stood, brushing her hands clean. Time is what the land needs, she replied, not pushing, not insisting, just placing the truth where it could be seen. He let that settle, then nodded once. We will start here, he said, and that was enough. They worked through the morning, not fast, not trying to force progress, just steady, the kind of work that builds on itself without needing to be measured every hour. Ethan handled the heavier cuts, shaping the outer edges with a shovel worn smooth from years of use, while Clara moved along the lines he set, refining, adjusting, pressing the soil into place so it would hold when water came. They did not speak much, only when it mattered. A few words to shift direction, a quiet note to adjust. The slope, the kind of communication that did not waste breath. By midday, the outline had begun to show, not finished, not perfect, but there, something that had not existed the day before now holding its place against the dry ground. Ethan stepped back, resting his weight on the handle of the shovel, looking over what they had made. It was simple, almost unremarkable to anyone passing by, but he knew better than that. Clara stood a few feet away, her gaze moving across the same lines, not with pride, not with doubt, just seeing it for what it was, a beginning. You have done this before, he said again, quieter this time, less a question than before. Clara did not turn right away. She let the wind pass over them once, before answering. Yes, she said, and nothing more. But this time, the word carried something deeper, something that did not need explaining. Ethan did not press further, because he understood now that whatever she knew, it was not something borrowed or guessed, it was something earned. And as they mounted their horses to head back, the land behind them no longer looked untouched. It held the mark of two people who had begun to shape it together. And though the sky above remained clear, offering no promise of rain, there was a quiet certainty in the work they had done, the kind that did not depend on what might come, but on what had already begun. That night, the sky stayed clear longer than it should have, the kind of empty stretch that usually meant another dry stretch ahead. But sometime past midnight, something shifted, not loud, not sudden, just a change in the air that settled over the land like a quiet promise. Ethan Hayes woke to the sound before he fully opened his eyes, a soft tapping at first, irregular, like something testing the ground, then steadier, more certain, rain, not heavy, not enough to flood or rush, but steady, enough to matter. He sat up in the loft, listening for a moment, the rhythm of it against the roof, the way it carried through the boards beneath him. And then he was moving, pulling on his boots, heading for the door without thinking twice. Outside, the rain fell in fine lines, soaking into the dust that had waited too long for it, the smell rising up sharp and clean. Clara Whitmore stood near the edge of the porch, already awake, already watching, her shawl pulled close around her shoulders. But her attention fixed not on the sky, but on the land beyond. You hear it. Different when you have been waiting for it. Ethan stepped beside her, not speaking at first. Both of them looking out toward the east ridge, where the shallow basin they had shaped lay hidden in the dark. They did not need to say anything. Not yet. After a moment, Clara stepped off the porch, moving into the rain without hesitation. Ethan followed, the ground already softening under their boots as they crossed the yard. The distance to the ridge felt shorter than it had the day before, or maybe it was just the way the night pulled them forward. When they reached the dip in the land, they stopped. The water had begun to gather, not rushing through, not slipping away, but settling, held in place by the edges they had shaped, shallow, just as she had said, but enough to give the soil something to hold on to, enough to change what would come next. Ethan stood there, rain soaking into his coat, watching the way the water spread slowly across the basin, filling the lines they had drawn into the earth, and for a moment, he did not look at the land. He looked at her. Clara stood just ahead of him, her face turned slightly toward the rising ground, her expression unchanged, not surprised, not proud, just steady, as if this was not something unexpected, but something she had known would come. You were right, he said, his voice low under the sound of the rain. Clara did not turn fully, just enough that he could see her eyes in the dim light. It only needed a place to stay, she replied, simple as ever, and there was something in those words that reached deeper than the moment itself, something about how she saw things, not as they were, but as they could be if given the chance. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze moving back to the basin, then beyond it, across the land that now held a little more than it had the day before. He had worked this ranch for years, had learned its patterns, its limits, the way it gave and the way it held back, but standing there, watching water gather where it had never stayed before, he realized something he had not allowed himself to consider, that maybe the land had not changed, maybe it had always been capable of more, and it had only been waiting for someone who knew how to see it differently. And when he looked at Clara again, he no longer saw the quiet woman who had stood last at the depot. He saw something else entirely, something he had not yet named, but could no longer ignore. And as the rain continued to fall, steady and patient, the space between them felt less like distance and more like something shared, something built not in words, but in the small, certain ways they had begun to shape the world around them together. The rain did not last long, just enough to soak the ground and settle the dust, but what it left behind carried through the next morning. The air felt different, heavier in a way that held promise instead of strain. Ethan Hayes stepped out onto the porch just after sunrise, the boards still damp beneath his boots, and for a moment he stood there, looking out across the land, the east ridge catching the early light, the shallow basin no longer hidden in shadow, but marked now by a darker stretch of soil where the water had stayed. He walked out toward it without thinking, his pace steady, not rushed, but with a purpose that had grown overnight. When he reached the edge, he stopped. The ground held firm under his weight, not soft enough to give way, but not dry enough to crack. It had taken the water and kept it, just as she had said it would. He crouched slightly, running his hand across the surface, feeling the difference, the quiet change that would not show itself all at once, but would build over time. Behind him, he heard her steps, light but certain. Clara Whitmore came to stand beside him, not speaking, not asking, just there, sharing the view as if it belonged to both of them now. It will hold longer than one rain, she said after a moment, her voice low. Ethan nodded once, his eyes still on the ground. Then we build from it, he replied, and this time, there was no hesitation in his words, no distance in the way he spoke. It was not his land alone in that moment, not his decision alone either. Clara shifted her gaze toward the rest of the field, the lines of dry grass still stretching out beyond. What they had changed. There are other places, she said, not as a suggestion, but as something already understood. Ethan stood, looking out with her, following the direction of her eyes, and for the first time, he did not just see the problems, he saw the possibility of shaping them, not all at once, not easily, but steadily, the way they had begun here. They walked back toward the house together, not speaking much, but the silence between them no longer felt like something separate, it moved with them, settled around them, part of the same rhythm they had been building without naming it. Later that morning, as Ethan worked near the barn, he found himself thinking about her words from the night before, about how she had spoken of the land as if it could be guided, not forced, and something about that stayed with him. The way she saw beyond what was in front of her, not in dreams or guesses, but in something grounded, something learned. When he stepped back into the house for water, he saw her at the table, not sewing, not resting, but writing, a small piece of paper held steady beneath her hand, the lines neat, practiced, not the uncertain strokes of someone unaccustomed to it. She folded it carefully when she noticed him, setting it aside without drawing attention, and though he did not ask, did not move toward it, the sight of it lingered. Another piece that did not quite fit the picture he had first been given, that she was the lowest, the one left behind, because there was nothing in the way she moved, nothing in the way she worked or thought, that matched that idea anymore. And as the day carried on, Ethan Hayes understood something with a quiet certainty, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady as the ground beneath him, that whatever Clara Whitmore had been before she arrived here, it was not something small, and whatever she had chosen to leave behind, it had not taken her strength with it. It happened in a way that did not feel like a revelation at first, not a moment marked by surprise or raised voices, but something quieter, something that unfolded the way truth often does when it has waited long enough. The afternoon had settled warm over the ranch, the kind of steady heat that pressed down without urgency, and Ethan Hayes had come in from the barn earlier than usual, dust still clinging to his coat, his mind turning over the same thoughts that had followed him since morning. He stepped into the house expecting the same quiet rhythm he had grown used to, but the table was not set for supper yet, and Clara Whitmore was not by the stove. Instead, she stood near the window, the light catching the edge of her face as she unfolded the same paper he had seen earlier, not hurried, not hidden, just deliberate, as if she had already decided it no longer needed to stay out of sight. Ethan paused just inside the doorway, not wanting to interrupt something he did not yet understand. She glanced up then, her eyes meeting his for a moment that held longer than most, and without a word, she turned the paper toward him, setting it flat on the table between them. It was not a letter in the way he had expected, not something recently written, but older, the creases worn, the ink still clear, a document more than a message. His eyes moved across the lines slowly. The formal language, the names, the land descriptions written in careful detail, acres measured, boundaries marked, ownership declared. He did not need to read every word to understand what it was, and when he looked back at her, there was no question left in his expression, only recognition. "You owned land," he said, his voice low, not surprised, just placing the truth where it belonged. Clara did not look away, did not soften or explain. She simply nodded once. "My family did," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that carried both distance and weight, not pride, not regret, just fact. Ethan glanced back at the paper, then around the room, the table, the stove, the small details she had shaped without announcement, and everything that had seemed unusual before now settled into place, not as separate pieces, but as part of a whole he had not seen clearly until now. "Why leave it?" he asked, not pressing, not demanding, just asking the question that remained. Clara folded the paper carefully, her hand steady. "My father believed land should be understood, not just owned," she said, her voice quiet. "He taught me how to work it, how to listen to it. But after he passed, others came who only saw what it could give, not what it needed." She paused then, not searching for words, but letting them come in their own time. "I did not belong there anymore." Ethan listened without interrupting, the weight of her words settling in a way that did not need more explanation. He looked at her differently now, not as someone he had taken in, not as someone who had simply arrived with nothing, but as someone who had chosen to leave something behind, something most people would have held on to. And yet here she stood, in a place that had asked nothing of her except the work she gave freely. He nodded once, not in agreement, not in judgment, just in understanding, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them. But it was not empty. It held something fuller now, something that had been there all along, waiting to be seen clearly. And as Ethan reached for the paper, not to take it, but to straighten its edge where it had shifted on the table, he realized something that settled deeper than anything before it, that he had never brought home someone small, never chosen someone lacking. What he had brought into this house, into this land, was something far greater than he had understood at the time, and now that he saw it, truly saw it, there was no part of him that wished to turn away from it. The evening settled slower than usual, the kind of quiet that follows after something has been understood but not yet spoken aloud in full, and the house held that feeling in every corner. The lamp burning low on the table, the soft crackle from the stove filling the spaces where words might have gone. Ethan Hayes sat across from Clara Whitmore, not eating yet, his hands resting loosely near his plate, his gaze not fixed on her, but not avoiding her either, just present in a way it had not been before, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, not because they did not know what to say, but because what had already been said carried enough weight on its own. It was Ethan who spoke first, not loudly, not with any effort to shape the moment into something more than it was. "You could have chosen any place," he said, his voice steady. "Why here?" Clara did not answer right away, her eyes resting on the tablecloth, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of it, as if following a line she already knew by memory. Then she looked up, not guarded, not distant, just clear, because this place needed to be seen, she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no attempt to soften the truth. Ethan leaned back slightly, letting that settle, his gaze moving briefly around the room. The stove, the table, the small signs of change that had become part of his everyday without him realizing when they had taken root. Most people would have seen what was wrong with it, he said. Clara gave a small shake of her head. Most people only see what is missing, she replied. I was taught to see what is still possible. The words stayed between them, quiet but certain, and something in Ethan shifted again, not in surprise, not in doubt, but in recognition of something he had not allowed himself to think before. He had believed, in some unspoken way, that he had brought her here to fill a space, to make the house less empty, to keep the work moving. But now he saw it differently, clearer. He had not filled a gap by bringing her here. He had opened something that had been closed off not just in the house, but in himself. He leaned forward then, resting his forearms on the table, his voice lower now, not because it needed to be, but because it carried something more personal than before. I thought I brought you here to help me keep this place going, he said, pausing just long enough to let the words stand on their own. But it has been the other way around. Clara did not interrupt, did not deflect. She simply watched him, her expression steady, not surprised by what he was saying, as if she had seen it long before he had found the words for it. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before lifting again. You did not come here with nothing, he continued. You came here with more than I understood, and there was no regret in his tone, only acknowledgement, the kind that comes when a man finally sees something for what it truly is. Clara's hands rested still now, no longer tracing the cloth, her voice quiet when she spoke. I came here because I wanted to build something that could last, she said, not something I owned, but something I could belong to. The words settled deep, not just in the room, but in the space between them, and for the first time, the silence that followed did not feel like something waiting to be filled. It felt complete, like a piece set firmly into place. Ethan reached for his cup, lifting it slowly, then paused, his eyes meeting hers again, steady, certain, and without needing to say anything more. He understood that whatever this was between them, whatever had been growing in small, quiet ways since the day at the depot, it was no longer uncertain. It was something real, something chosen, not out of need, but out of recognition. And as the lamp burned lower and the night settled around the house, the space they shared no longer felt like two lives crossing paths. It felt like something held, something built together, one small, steady moment at a time. The days that followed did not feel like an ending, not in the way stories are often told, but more like something settling into its proper place, steady and quiet, the kind of change that does not need to be announced to be real. The land began to answer in small ways first. The basin held moisture longer than before. The grass near its edges turned a deeper shade of green, not all at once. Not enough for a man to stand back and call it a transformation, but enough that it could not be ignored. Ethan Hayes noticed it each morning when he walked the fence line. The way his steps slowed without him meaning them to. The way his eyes stayed a little longer on the ground that had once been dry and unyielding, and inside the house, the changes were just as steady. The table no longer felt like something set for necessity, but for presence. 2 plates placed side by side without thought, the cloth always smooth flat. The coffee poured before it was asked for, not out of habit, but out of something that had grown between them without needing to be named. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the ridge, and the light stretched long across the porch, Ethan stepped inside to find Clara already seated, her hands resting lightly on the table, not waiting, not calling for him, just there, as she had been from the beginning, but different now in a way he could not have explained before. He set his hat on the peg, washed his hands, and took his place across from her, the chair creaking in that familiar way. But the sound no longer echoed in an empty room. They ate in silence again, the same quiet that had once filled the space between strangers, but now carried something else, something settled, something shared. And when he finished, he did not stand right away. He let the moment hold, his hands resting on the table, his gaze lifting to meet hers. There was no need for long words, no need to shape what had already become clear. "This place feels different," he said, his voice low. Clara's eyes moved around the room once, then back to him. "It always could have been," she replied, and there was no pride in it, no claim, just truth. Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze shifting toward the window where the last light touched the edge of the field. "I did not see it before," he said, and that was as close to an admission as he had ever come. Clara did not correct him, did not soften the words. She simply let them stand, because they did not need changing. After a moment, Ethan reached across the table, not quickly, not with hesitation, just a simple movement, his hand coming to rest over hers. Rough against rough, steady against steady, and for a brief second, neither of them moved, not pulling away, not holding tighter, just letting the contact exist as it was, something chosen, something real. Outside, the wind moved across the land, softer now, carrying with it the faint scent of damp soil and growing things, the kind of smell that only comes when something has begun to take root. And inside, the silence that followed was no longer something either of them carried alone. It belonged to both of them, held between them like the table, like the house, like the land itself. And as the light faded and the first stars began to show above the ridge, Ethan Hayes understood something with a certainty that did not need to be spoken again. That what had started as a simple choice, a quiet decision made on a dusty platform, had become something far greater than he had ever intended, not because it was planned, but because it had been built, piece by piece, in the smallest of ways, until it could no longer be anything else. And across from him, Clara Whitmore did not look like someone who had been chosen last. She looked like someone who had finally found where she belonged, and in that same quiet way, so had he.